ETCS Bites Back. And this time we're not going to be looking at ETCS at all. Instead, we're going to be looking at level crossings in Great Britain. Bit of a background. And then in the next edition, we'll be looking at how ETCS can affect the management, safety, and control of level crossings. So let's start with a bit of history. Well, I think you all know that railways started in this country. But before railways, there were a lot of roads. And since they came first, they get priority. That continues to be the case. The early Acts of Parliament that allowed railways to be built also required that railways had to be fenced. This was to stop animals and other creatures getting onto the railway. Mainly because, of course, you were going across other people's land, and they were farmers, and they didn't want their cows and sheep to get knocked over by these horrible steam trains. And those same landowners only sold the railway's land if they could continue to get access to all of their fields, and often there were routes across the railway for those landowners to take their sheep, cows, or whatever from part of their land to another part. And those rights were enshrined often in the Railways Acts. So just to be sure and clear, we're only looking at crossings in Great Britain. Even within Great Britain, there are many, many variations of the key types. Historically, various versions have been created, and some of the very old ones still remain, whilst the newer ones have been introduced. And each circumstance is different. A generic crossing does not really exist. So what can go across a railway? And here we're talking about level crossings, or sometimes known as grade crossings, where the other route goes across on the same level. That could be a public highway, typically a road. It can be a private road. It might be a public bridleway or footpath. Or it can be a barrow or staff crossing, somewhere for people to cross the line in order to get perhaps from one platform to another or to a signal box. So let's have a little look at those different types of crossing. Let's start with public highways because there's a lot of them and they are high profile. It's often said that level crossings are the railway's biggest risk. But there again, I've heard other people say that the safest part of a public highway, in terms of your likelihood to have an accident and be injured or killed, is actually the little bit on a level crossing. Originally, the railway was equipped with manual gates. And if you remember, the railways had to be fenced, so the gates had to be across the railway all of the time to let the road through, and only when trains were coming could the gates be swung across the roadway to allow the trains to pass. Early on, they wouldn't have had a stop signal protecting them. The red diamond, in this case, or a red circle on the gates would be the stop signal, and only a distance signal would be provided. Sometimes that distance signal would not even be worked, it would just be fixed at caution. Later on, gates began to get locks, and gate or key locks were included. In this case, in the picture, we have a lock in the roadway that locks the gate in place and proves that it is in the right place for trains or the road as appropriate. And that could then be interlocked with the signals. When there were few cars and many horses and carts, it didn't really matter that someone had to go out into the road to stop the traffic. And a gated crossing typically just relied on the attendant walking out slowly with the gates, and anything coming could stop. But as speed increased, it began to include traffic lights or road traffic lights at the gates to help the attendant. Now, traffic lights are what we mean by the lights you see at a road junction, red, amber, green. But road traffic lights are a specific type of light which is used at level crossings and some other locations. A road traffic light has two flashing red lights alternating, preceded by a single yellow light. And the difference in meaning is that an emergency vehicle, police or ambulance or fire, can go past a traffic light, having checked, of course, that it's safe, whereas the two flashing red lights mean that nobody must go past, even in emergency. And in order to reduce the workload on people and costs, gates were steadily replaced by lifting barriers, which meant they could be power worked and that the attendant wouldn't even need to get out of their cabin. So there are probably three key types of full barrier crossing. The full barrier goes across the roadway and any adjacent walkways. Quite often the barrier will have what's called a skirt, a series of bars hanging down that join the barrier down to the roadway. The skirt is only really needed if there's frequently animals using the road, or it's an area where there are lots of children, but in fact it generally gets provided because it's easier to provide than it is to argue about not providing it. The first type of barrier crossing would be where the signaller checks nobody is trapped before clearing signals. They would look out at the signal box immediately beside the crossing or nearby and check visually that it is clear. They might be provided with some lights to help them see on a night time. Alternatively, the signaller may be remote from the crossing, in which case they could use CCTV to look to see whether, again, the crossing is clear. And having checked it is clear, then they can clear the signals. And the last type is to use obstacle detection. Automated systems to identify people or other obstructions on the crossing. CCTV pictures originally were black and white and could often burn in as the old-fashioned cathode ray tubes could get a ghostly image of the crossing, and it could be quite hard to see that there was nobody in the corners, particularly if there was a dark corner or it was at night. Or, of course, if on this picture, the building at the top left has got lots of bright security lights that come on at night, that can make it hard to see the crossing. The obstacle detector generally takes the form of a radar unit, often called a tic-tac. Of course, other bin suites do exist. And it scans the whole of the crossing area, typically about 0.3 to 0.5 meters above the road surface. In order to detect obstructions on the road surface itself, there is also quite often a LiDAR, a light detecting and ranging system, which is the little grey box between the tracks. The combination of the two enables us to check that there is no obstruction on the crossing. Which, of course, is an interesting point, is what are we looking for? Well, obviously we don't want people on the crossing, although they can move to the barriers. So more importantly is we don't want road vehicles on the crossing, because if a train hits them, that could be serious. And similarly, we don't want anything that's fallen off, perhaps the lorry on the bottom right of the left-hand picture, has dropped some wood or onto the crossing. Anything on the crossing that could derail a train is actually more hazardous than actually worrying about the people who should not be there in the first place. And so the LiDAR is looking for obstructions at ground level. Those systems are not ideal because they have to be interlocked into the signalling system. Until the gates have been proved, these signals can't be cleared. If there's any problem with the gates or the crossing proving or the crossing clear processes, then the signals are going to be held at danger. And it's those checks that the crossing is closed to road traffic and proved safe, which causes a problem, because that takes time, and we don't want to delay the trains. So to avoid delaying trains, we would normally start closing the crossing up to 3 minutes before the faster train could arrive. Obviously, if the train arrives, coming is slower, it's going to take even longer. And on busy lines where there are a lot of trains, that hardly gives time for the crossing to be open for cars at all. And then you get frustration, people jumping the lights, people pushing through the barriers. So how about we provide clear stop lights? We provide a barrier across the left-hand side of the road. In the UK, we drive on the left, so that is the entrance side to the crossing. We assume that the crossing equipment will always work, or it will work so many times that we don't need to worry about the odd failure. And even with clever design, we can make sure that it will partially work. And therefore, we can close the crossing just in time so that drivers won't get impatient. What leads to a type of crossing called automatic half barriers. Half barrier because it only goes halfway across the road. Automatic because it works automatically. Triggered by an approaching train. The signals on the railway line do not depend on the crossing having worked. Trains can approach with the crossing still untriggered. Road users will get about 3 seconds of yellow, then 5 seconds of the flashing red lights before the barriers will lower. Once they're lowered, then the train should arrive within about 10 to 20 seconds later, depending on the speed of the train. Because the train arrives quickly and the drivers are not having to wait, then the crossing abuse should be reduced. These sort of crossings are generally suitable on quieter roads away from housing and the like, and perhaps where the road speed is not too high. Originally, rail speed was not restricted, but in order to reduce the consequence of any accident, and unfortunately there have been a few, then rail speed is now restricted. Problem is that roads have got busier. Houses and factories have been built, traffic has changed, lorries may now be waiting to get into industrial units and causing a queue on the main road with cars across the crossing. And for all these reasons and others, new automatic half barriers are not going to be installed. Quite early on in the history of automatic half barriers, unfortunately, there was a serious accident at Hickson. The company were transporting a very large transformer. You can see one of the lorries in the left-hand side that was towing it. Unfortunately, the people in charge of the movement, including the police, didn't understand these new automatic half barriers. They didn't understand that they were meant to ring the signaller and have the line blocked if they were going to go across with anything difficult to maneuver. They carried on, and of course the lights started flashing, and a few seconds later a train smashed into the side of the transformer, causing a huge amount of damage and loss of life. After that, many things were changed around automatic half barriers. The signs were improved, more telephones were provided, better guidance was given in the highway code, but still it was a risk. And that was part of the reason that eventually automatic half barriers went out of favour. So open level crossings. These are crossings which don't have barriers of any type. They could just be a road crossing with just some signs telling the road users to stop and look. Might be suitable on a low-speed road and a low-speed railway where there's very good visibility, or perhaps where only very few road vehicles use the crossing. Can have added to it red flashing road lights and audible warnings, but they're not much in favour nowadays because unfortunately road users do not obey the rules in the highway code very well. They abuse level crossings, possibly because of ignorance. So, for example, at Ardrossan, just off the end of the platform, on the main road, there used to be an open crossing. And you can see there was a lot of abuse because there's a yellow stoplight camera to catch those people who ignored the road lights. And it got a lot of flashes. The other problem is that if people do miss the lights, there's nothing else to warn them to stop. And at a place called Lockington, unfortunately, a van driver was turning out of a side turning and failed to spot the road traffic lights because they were concentrating on the turn, not on the level crossing, and they drove straight into the front of a passenger train travelling at speed. And again, there was a loss of life. So open level crossings became very restricted in the locations they could be used and have gone out of favour and not used much nowadays. So what do we do when we have a level crossing that's a long way away and there is poor communication? When it's too expensive to put someone there permanently to monitor the crossing? Well, what we can do is ask the driver to slow down so that they can stop at the crossing and they can check that the crossing is working. A flashing white light can be displayed and they can then check there is nothing on the crossing before proceeding. And because they've slowed down, if there is a problem, they can always stop at the crossing without going onto the roadway. So let's have a look. Here's a typical open crossing at the top. Above the W whistle board, there is a light, and that's the flashing white light. And that will flash once the red road lights have been triggered and flashing for a sufficient period of time. The one at the bottom has got barriers. You can just about see them in going up into the air. Those barriers will come down once the train is approaching, but the white light will actually only prove that the red road traffic lights are working. And this is a more recent installation which has got a red flashing light permanently lit until the crossing is operating, so the driver can see where the crossing is, even at dark or poor visibility. So what does it look like for a driver? You should be able to see the cars and vans crossing the road ahead. You may just be able to pick up in the distance a red flashing light. As you can see, the driver gets quite close before anything happens. Now, as the barriers begin to lower, we have the white flashing light, telling the driver it is safe to cross. The X board on the left is the point of no return. If that white light is not flashing or the crossing is obstructed, the driver needs to stop as quickly as possible from that X board. So that was obviously on an ETCS railway. So what about private roads? Well, there's an awful lot of them. Network Rail are trying to eliminate them, but some users hang on to them like for dear life. They're often known as occupation or accommodation crossings because they gave access to someone's house or were used as part of work. Normally the gates would be locked across the road. Now here's where it is unusual, the opposite of the public highway. And authorised users would have keys. And it would be their responsibility to unlock the gates, check the line is clear, drive across or move across, and then close the gates behind them. Unfortunately, not all users close the gates, particularly when they give keys to visitors or when the number of users increases. Someone will leave the gate open for a car that's following, and then the following car won't bother to close the gates. And also the problem with these is that they have gone from being an occasional use by a farmer or landowner to being on the route to industrial units, marinas, caravan parks, and all sorts. So there's lots and lots of users, and not everybody could be given a key. In this case, some sites now have red-green stoplights and much clearer signage to help the road user. The instructions are that the road user stops at the stop line, goes down, checks the green light is lit, opens the gates on both sides of the track, goes back to their vehicle, checks again that the green light is still lit, and then drives straight across the crossing. Before going back, checking the other green light is lit in order to cross the lines, in order to shut the gates, and having shut the gates, then they can drive off. It can be a bit of a faff, and obviously You can tell there are some people who will not obey even simple rules like this and will just leave the gates open. But at least we've still got the red-green light. Bridleways and footpaths also cross the railway, and typically these just have a stop, look and listen sign, and it's up to the users of these crossings to look both ways and listen. Because sometimes we will provide a whistle board so that the driver can provide an audible warning. If visibility is not perfect in one direction, then a whistle board can help. Although, unfortunately, a lot of people now wear headphones, and whistle boards have little impact. If there's not sufficient sighting, or there are too many crossing users, again, we can provide red-green lights. Now, the red-green lights for footpaths and for those private roads are not interlocked with the signalling. They overlay on top of the signalling system. An approaching train causes the lights to go, the signal to go red, but it has no impact on the railway signalling at all. And our last area is barrow and staff crossings. Sometimes it's necessary to get from one platform to another, perhaps with a pushchair or a wheelchair, historically with big loads of cases which porters would push across. There are some locations where it's the only way to get between two platforms, and it's important then that people look carefully for trains that are coming. Where it's not clear which way trains are approaching from, then a white light can be provided, and this is often applied on staff crossings. When the white light is lit, then it is safe to cross. No trains are signalled over the crossing. When the white light is out, then it is not safe, a form of fail-safe. So what are the safety concerns? Well, unfortunately, public behaviour is not predictable. Too many people have got headphones in, busy on their mobile phone. They don't always read all the signage. They think they know what they're doing. And if they do get trapped, they do all sorts of stupid things. Like if your car is trapped on a railway line between the gates, would you all be milling around it, working out how to get it out? Or would you not all be getting to the side in case a train did arrive? People get frustrated and then they break the rules. People jump over the closed barriers and run across, sometimes losing a shoe if they're lucky, but they could be losing their life. On open crossings, people don't always take any notice and will drive across even when a train is coming and when the red lights are flashing. And we've got to remember that trains cannot stop quickly. Even if the driver sees somebody on the crossing or starting to cross, then there's not much the driver can do other than sound the horn, apply the brake and hope. And remember that quite a small obstacle can derail a train, particularly on a flat surface like a level crossing, where things can get wedged into the groove where the flange would go, so it can lift a train more easily than perhaps on open track.
That's toast! That's bad!
So in our next edition, we're going to have a look at what ETCS can do to improve the situation. How can it improve the control of level crossings? Perhaps to reduce the time that the crossing will be closed to road traffic, so reducing the likelihood of misuse. What will happen in degraded situations? How can we make ETCS work better? Or how can we make the crossing work better in those situations? It's not always easy to think of all the things that can go wrong. And another thing we need to think about is that whilst we could do lots of things with ETCS or with the level crossing system, we need to understand whether the risk is big enough to justify those developments, or actually whether it is better just to close the level crossings.